The air at the relay core tasted of copper and ozone, and something like machine oil boiled to ruin. Councillor Vielle found him there, back to a scorched bulkhead, one hand pressed into the ruined meat of his own left forearm, the other still wrapped around a 40-centimetre chromium steel pipe wrench that had, in the last 6 hours, ended more Vreth warriors than she could count. His eyes were half closed. His jacket was soaked black. She had left him for dead. She had voted for it in open council, and she had watched him climb down out of a maintenance vent and volunteer for the errand anyway. She had spent the whole intervening night convincing herself he was already a corpse. Now he looked up at her, blood on his teeth, and asked the strangest question of her long, careful life. 6 hours earlier, the air in the ventilation shaft above the council floor had tasted of copper and ozone, and cheap synthetic grease boiled dry. Nate Coffey lay belly down in a maintenance duct 4 meters above the council chamber, torque driver in one fist, half-eaten protein bar in the other. He was not supposed to be listening. He was supposed to be tightening a mounting bolt on an air handler that had been chattering for a week. He heard the vote anyway. Sound in the ducts did not travel like sound in a room. It shivered along the sheet metal, ran to him through the grating in the diffuser, and delivered every syllable of the motion cleanly to his ear. The word expendable translated cleanly. Councillor Vielle, whose true name was a chord of resonant overtones, the translator simply crushed into a single syllable, delivered the motion without ceremony. Her voice carried the practiced calm of somebody who had already accepted the arithmetic. The human utility technician attached to the Earth Observer delegation was, she said, the most logically acceptable sacrifice. He had no rank, he had no clan. He would not be missed by any of the 12 signatory powers. He was already inside the maintenance corridors on his rounds. The mission profile called for a body willing to walk into the relay core and cut the subspace beacon before the Thesseroy Compact could confirm the summit coordinates and jump an interdiction fleet into the system. The math had been run 3 times. It was unsurvivable. No one objected. The vote closed in 11 seconds. Nate finished the bolt he was tightening. He pocketed the protein bar. He climbed down. He volunteered at the chamber door before Vielle's aide had finished drafting the order. That was the moment Vielle's bioluminescent dorsal bands, involuntary status signals too old to lie, flickered into the pattern her people called Keth Sora. It sat somewhere between shame and what have we done. Her aide caught it, looked away quickly, and pretended not to. The rest of the council did not know Kethra biology well enough to read her, which was mercy. Vielle's throat did a small dry thing, and she straightened on her dais and reminded herself she had voted for this because she believed in the summit. Because 1,000 years of shooting at each other across 3 arms of the spiral had to end somewhere. And this was the room where it might. A single expendable technician was a very small price. The human was standing in the doorway, protein bar back in his mouth, chewing. "I'll take it," he said, around the food. "But I need 3 things." The silence that followed him was the wrong kind. Councillors did not usually meet the eyes of tools. This one was looking at every face on the dais and doing something with his own eyes that Vielle did not have a category for. It was not a plea. It was not defiance. It was more like a foreman on a scaffold measuring joists. "State them," Vielle said. "A bolt kit," Nate said. He held up one finger. "The good kind. Tungsten tips, 40-centimeter shaft, pneumatic drive. There's one in the delegation locker on level 6. He held up a second finger. "My wrench. It came up with my personal effects. It's in a black canvas roll in the observer quarters. Nobody moves it, nobody touches it." He held up a third finger, and he waited a beat longer than was comfortable. "And I need to know where you're keeping the 3 sleeper agents that are still sitting in this chamber." Every voice in the room went out at once. It was not the theatrical hush of surprise. It was the harder silence of 38 council members recalculating a threat model in real time. Vial's aide made a small, startled sound. Councillor Ram of the Orderland Trade Bloc, seated to Vial's left, produced a low, querying trill. On the opposite crescent of benches, 3 delegates, spaced beautifully apart, went absolutely still. "Explain," Vial said, and her voice was the first careful thing she had said all day. "Deployment manifest for a Vreth insertion package lists 35 bodies," the human said. He was still chewing, though he had stopped noticing. "I counted 32 sets of boot prints coming through the outer maintenance run. That's a delta of 3. 3 didn't come in through the shaft, because 3 were already inside. Standard Vreth doctrine puts sleepers in the target room to spike the vote and shoot the survivors when the assault team breaks in. So I'd like to know if you've swept for them, and if not, I would very much like the deck plans and their passcodes, because I would like not to have 3 people shoot me in the back once I start moving." He paused. "Ma'am," he added. Vial's dorsal bands did the Keth Sora thing again, brighter, and she made no effort to hide it this time. She had been a soldier once, before she was a diplomat. She recognized the shape of what was standing in her doorway the way a mountain climber recognized the sound of a snowpack shifting. It was still small, it was still quiet, it was about to move, and everything downhill of it was going to be different. "Sergeant of the Guard," she said without taking her eyes off the human, "sweep this chamber, now. Delegates remain seated. Anyone who stands is to be considered hostile." 3 delegates stood. The room did the practical, sensible thing and became in the span of half a breath a battlefield. The first sleeper was a Bellaran envoy in an ambassador's robe, 4 rows up, who came off his bench with a stripped-down pulse lance already unfolding from beneath the fabric. He never finished. The human moved past Vial's dais without touching it. Nate had picked up something from the small ceremonial table beside the door on his way in, an ornamental grav mallet the Kethra used to open sessions, 20 centimeters of dense black metal on a short handle, and he threw it, not at the Bellaran's chest, at the pulse lance itself, at the little rectangular magnetic housing on the underside where the plasma bottle formed its cycle. The mallet hit the housing on the 4th spin. The housing cracked. The plasma bottle failed to close. The pulse lance was a beautifully engineered piece of coherent violence. It was also, for exactly 1.4 seconds, a shaped tube full of unbottled plasma. It vented sideways into the Bellaran envoy who had been holding it, and the Bellaran envoy stopped existing above the collarbone. The chamber went absolutely silent. Nate was already moving. The second sleeper, a Thesseroi observer in the 3rd row, had drawn a smaller weapon, a coherent light pistol. He got 1 shot off. The shot went wide because Nate had crossed the aisle in a low, ugly animal sprint, and he was inside the sleeper's guard before the second shot could bloom. He hit the sleeper once, in the throat, with the meat of his palm. The sleeper folded. Nate took the pistol on the way down and put it in his belt without breaking stride. The 3rd sleeper, a small figure in the acoustic-shielded booth reserved for the Ministrant of Fen, had frozen. She was very young. She could not have been more than a season past her first shedding. She was holding a plasma cutter of the sort used for cargo work. She was crying. The tears were the wrong color for the species, which meant that she was not the species she was pretending to be. Vial saw all of this in the same frozen second Nate did. Vial's mandibles opened to order restraint. Nate did not kill the 3rd sleeper. He crossed the floor at the same low, ugly speed, closed the distance in 3 steps, and disarmed her with a wrist lock that Vial would later, when she reviewed the footage, discover was pulled from a Terran police manual 80 years out of date. He put the plasma cutter carefully on the deck. He pulled a zip tie from a pouch on his belt, of all things, cinched her hands, and set her on the floor of the booth with her back against the wall. He said something to her in a low voice. Vial's translator caught it a beat late. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Somebody told you to do this. Later you're going to tell me who. Now stay put and don't get shot." Then he was back at the dais. He was slightly out of breath. There was a smear of the Belleran's fluids across the shoulder of his coverall. He looked at Vielle like a man who had just cleared a jammed conveyor and was ready to keep working. "Ma'am," he said. "The bolt kit." The sergeant of the guard, standing at the door with a rifle he had not fired, said, "Counselor, do we—" "Get him the bolt kit," Vielle said, "and his wrench, and the deck plans." "He is a technician," Counselor Ram said, in the mildly plaintive register the ortolans used when they wanted to seem reasonable. "This is not appropriate work for a—" "He is what is available," Vielle said. It came out harder than she meant. "And he is what has already saved this chamber. Give him what he asks for." The chamber emptied itself efficiently after that. Delegates went down through their private lifts. Aides herded ministers along corridors that had been cleared and swept. The 2 dead sleepers were carried out in bags. The young one was taken away, still weeping, still zip-tied, still alive, because a human utility technician had decided that a scared kid with a cutting torch was worth the extra 1.6 seconds it took to break a wrist instead of a neck. Vielle found herself standing at the empty dais next to the human. His breathing had already slowed. He was looking down at the ceremonial mallet, which he had walked back and retrieved, and he was frowning at a small chip along one edge. "Sorry about your mallet," he said. Vielle's mandibles clicked. It was the closest her species came to laughter. It caught her off guard. "Coffee," she said. It was the first time she had used his name in his presence. "How did you know about the sleepers?" He did not look at her. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been up in your ceiling for 6 weeks. You'd be amazed what you overhear when the air handlers are running quiet. The Belleran ambassador changed his voice pattern 3 days ago. He didn't think anybody was listening. The Thesseroy one has been coming to sessions with a limp on the wrong side. The ministrant kid, she was replaced last week. The original hasn't been seen since a supply barge docked on Tuesday. I flagged it. Nobody read the report." He shrugged. "I fix air handlers," he said. "I also read the mail." Vielle looked at him for a very long moment. "Sergeant," she said without looking away, "cancel the standing arrest order on the human observer's file. All of it. Whatever is in there, I want it seen. Now." The sergeant hesitated. "Counselor," he said, "the Terran delegation has a standing seal on that file, diplomatic privilege. We cannot—" "Do it," Vielle said. "I will explain to the Earth ambassador personally later, if there is a later." Nate went to get his wrench. The wrench came up out of a black canvas roll that had been sitting at the bottom of a footlocker in the observer quarters for 11 months. It was 40 centimeters of chromium steel, worn to a soft grey along the head, with a mark stamped near the pivot that read Holbrook and a number that had almost rubbed away. Nate lifted it out with both hands, the way a Kethra elder handled a ceremonial harness. He tested the jaw with his thumb. He tightened the adjustment. He held it out at arm's length and let it hang there for a second. Vielle's aide, who had followed him down at Vielle's order, watched this and did not understand any of it. "That is a tool," the aide said carefully, because she had been trained in careful things. "Yes, ma'am," Nate said. "You are going against Vreth pulse lances," the aide said, "with a tool." "Yes, ma'am," Nate said. He slid the wrench through a loop on his belt, made sure it hung right, and started walking toward the maintenance access point on level 9. The aide caught up to him at the elevator. She had, without quite noticing herself doing it, begun typing. "Human," she said. "Coffee. There is an unencrypted band open. The counselor is patched in. She says, what would you like her to know before you go in?" Nate thought about it. "Tell her," he said, "that if she gets a chance to look, she should look at what a Holbrook wrench is for. It was for taking apart mine cages. My dad used one for 31 years, 200 meters underground, in a place called Harlan County on Earth. It's a family thing." The aide typed it word for word. The elevator hissed open. Nate stepped in. "Also tell her," he added, "that I don't work for free." I'll want to talk about that later, if there's a later. The doors closed. The aide looked up at the ceiling of the corridor, where the observer's quiet human had spent 6 weeks memorizing the shape of a station most of its inhabitants had never bothered to learn, and she felt the same cold, small thing crawl along her carapace that Vielle had felt on the dais. She patched Vielle on the private line. "He's in," she said. "Counselor, I need to tell you something." "Say it." "I don't think he was ever a technician. The Vreth insertion team was 32 bodies of the reason the Vreth ascendancy had never quite lost a war. They were fast, they were coordinated, they carried pulse lances that could vent a room, and they had done this specific job 41 times across their careers. They had already killed 4 Kethra honor guards in the first corridor. The bodies were still warm. The corridor was long and low and lit only in emergency red, because the assault team had taken out the main lights on their way in, because dark favored their optics and not the defenders. Dark, as it turned out, also favored Nate Coffey. The first Vreth came around the T-junction at the end of the corridor at a full lean, pulse lance up tracking. He had good instincts. He fired before he had a proper line, on the theory that a plasma bloom in a corridor was almost always a hit. The plasma bloomed. It cooked a stripe down the bulkhead. It missed the human because the human was not standing there. The human was in the ceiling, in the maintenance tray that ran along the top of the corridor above the lighting, and he was tightening a bolt. The bolt was a tungsten-tipped pneumatic in a driver Nate had spent the elevator ride assembling. He had cut the safety off. He had modified the pressure regulator. He had done this in the dark, by touch, while riding down. The bolt driver was rated for structural work at short range. Hard steel through hard steel. It was not rated for a Vreth's cranial armor. The tungsten tip did not know that. It went through the cranial armor the way a Holbrook wrench went through a corroded flange nut, with a small, sharp, mechanical noise and no fuss. The first Vreth fell. The second Vreth heard the noise, misread it, and stepped forward. Nate did not use the bolt driver for the second one. He was already down, out of the ceiling. The wrench came around in a low, practiced arc that started at his knee and ended somewhere behind the second Vreth's dorsal armor. Vreth's dorsal armor was excellent against energy. It was not designed for a 40-centimeter chromium steel lever swung by a man who had grown up loading coal cars. The corridor went silent. Nate stood over the second body for exactly 1 heartbeat. He was breathing through his nose. His shoulders had come down. Somewhere between the elevator and this hallway, something had loosened in him. And Vielle, watching through the sergeant's tactical feed, saw it happen and did not have a word for it in her language. The tired shape had gone. The easygoing shape had gone. There was a man standing in the corridor now who moved like the corridor was already his. The weight had fallen. That was not a man tired anymore. That was the predator at the top of the chain. Vielle found her mandibles were dry. "Talk to me," she said into the private line. "Sergeant, what is he doing?" "He is moving toward the second maintenance run," the sergeant said. His voice had gone very flat. "He is not taking cover. He is walking, ma'am. He is walking." The Bellerin envoy's file arrived on Vielle's console 11 minutes later. The Terran delegation had not, in the end, argued about the seal. They had, in fact, ceased responding to her office at all, which was a message in itself. The file that came through was thinner than Vielle had expected. The redactions were the second thing she noticed. The first was the photograph. The photograph was Nate Coffey. It was younger by 10 years. He was in a uniform Vielle did not recognize, a dark green tunic with a small pin at the collar that was not a rank device but a piece of formal metalwork with a name and a set of numbers. He was standing at attention on a strip of pale ground under an alien sky. There were other men beside him. All the other men in the picture had their faces obscured with heavy black. Below the photograph on the first page of the file, one line was legible. The rest was gone, transferred to civilian status per recommendation of the medical board at subject's request. No further service indicated. Vial scrolled. Under this line, page after page, were pages of black bars. Occasional words survived. She read them in the order they surfaced. The word Gerfalcon, the word Talos, the word Sole Survivor. A date that placed a 19-year-old Nate Coffey inside a compound that Vial's intelligence briefings, 3 species and 40 years ago, had considered impossible to enter and impossible to leave. Everyone had died. That was the entire official history of the event. Everyone had died, and the compound had gone silent, and nothing had ever come out of it. Except, apparently, a single Terran corporal who had walked 70 kilometers out through the surrounding waste to the nearest recovery point and had asked the recovery pilot for a hot meal and a cigarette before saying anything else. That corporal, according to the surviving fragments, had not spoken about what happened for 6 months. When he had finally been debriefed, he had said, quote, "I don't want to do this anymore, sir. I want a quiet job. I want to fix things." The board had granted his request. He had been given, at his specific and repeated insistence, a civilian technician's rating and assignment to a low-priority observer delegation on the far edge of contested space, where no one would ever look at him twice. Vial's mandibles came together with a small, dry click. "Get me the Terran ambassador," she said. "I don't care about protocol. Get him." "Counselor," her aide said. "He is not answering. The Terran mission has gone into what they call a listening posture. They will not comment." "Of course they won't," Vial said. Her voice was very flat. She looked at the file. She looked at the tactical feed, where a man carrying an outdated pipe wrench was walking, unhurried, toward a knot of Vreth warriors who had, 10 minutes ago, been the most dangerous thing in this quadrant. "Sergeant," she said, "patch me into his headset." "He has no headset, ma'am." "His translator, then. His earpiece. He must have something." "He does, ma'am. He turned it off before he went in." "Turn it back on. Override." The sergeant hesitated. "Ma'am, he pulled the battery." Vial closed her eyes for a moment. She reopened them. "Fine," she said. "Then we watch. And when he comes back out, if he comes back out, I would like a full band open channel ready, and I would like this file, all of it, unredacted, put in front of the entire signatory council, every delegate. I want them to look at what they voted to expend." "Ma'am," her aide said quietly, "everyone will see." "Everyone should see," Vial said. "We are the ones who need to see it." By then, Nate was already at the 4th Vreth of the 2nd corridor. The 4th Vreth of the 2nd corridor was a squad leader, taller than the others, with a command band across the crest of his helm and a heavier pulse lance with a coolant loop that hissed audibly in the dark. He had spent the last 3 minutes calling his men and getting nothing back. He was smart enough to have adjusted his own posture. He was not standing in a straight corridor. He was in the elbow of a junction, with his back to a bulkhead, his lance tracking in a slow arc, and a tactical pattern detector strapped to his forearm that painted every warm body within 30 meters in a soft, ghostly green. The pattern detector saw nothing. Nate had been in the maintenance chase behind the bulkhead for 2 minutes and 11 seconds. He was not warm anymore. He had shed his coverall, wrapped his exposed skin in mylar heat film from the emergency stores, and let his body temperature drop into the range of the surrounding station structure. He had done this while listening to the Vreth squad leader's boots on the deck. He had done it in the dark. He had done it in something like 90 seconds. The squad leader was smart, and being smart, he did the thing a smart soldier does when his senses report nothing and his men report nothing, which was to speak into his throat mic and request an extraction abort. The abort request went out on the standard Vreth encrypted band. Nate did not speak the standard Vreth encrypted band. The kid he had zip-tied in the council chamber, however, had. Later, when Vielle tried to reconstruct exactly how the human had known the abort code word, she could only conclude that he had asked her before he had left the chamber. He must have crouched down in front of that terrified young cadet with the wrong-colored tears and asked her gently for the one thing he knew a rookie sleeper would spill under pressure and think she had gotten away with cheap. What is the mission abort? Sweet kid, don't lie. Because if you lie, I have to check every one of them. And if I have to check every one of them, I might miss the right one. She had told him. He had thanked her. He had zip-tied her hands and set her carefully against the wall. Nate spoke the abort word softly into the maintenance chase, in a passable approximation of the squad leader's own voice, 10 seconds after the leader had transmitted it. The confirmation came back on the leader's earpiece a beat later. Confirmed. Fall back. Rendezvous at insertion. The squad leader hesitated. Then he did the second thing a smart soldier does when his sensors and his men are silent and the abort is confirmed, which was to turn and walk toward the insertion point. Nate opened the access panel behind him. The wrench came around one time. The corridor was silent. There was, by Vielle's count, 27 Vreth left. Somewhere around the 16th Vreth, the tactical feeds started picking up something Vielle did not initially recognize. There was a young Kethra ensign, one of the surviving guards from the outer perimeter, who had fallen back into a service closet with a broken jaw and no working weapon, and had, by the code of her lineage, refused to abandon her post. She was holed up in the closet with her back against the door and her broken jaw wired shut with a strip of medical tape from a first aid kit, and she had, without meaning to, ended up on Nate's route through the maintenance runs. Nate had, on entering the closet through the ceiling, taken one look at her and understood the situation. He had knelt down. He had taken off the medical tape, retaped it correctly, checked her pupils with a hand torch, and asked her, in the calmest voice he had used all day, if she was okay to move. She had shaken her head. "That's fine," he had said. "Then I'm going to give you a fast lesson while I sit here for 6 minutes. I would appreciate it very much if you listened. It might come in handy the next time you have to explain to your grandchildren why a human friend of yours won a war for you with a plumbing tool." The ensign, who was 17 standard cycles old and had never spoken to a human before, had blinked once and stayed very still. Nate had leaned back against the closet wall opposite her, laid the wrench across his knees, and started to talk. The tactical feeds were still hot. The audio picked it up. Vielle, in her chamber, listening, went very quiet. "So the thing about a pulse lance," Nate said, in the tone of a man explaining a piece of equipment to an apprentice, "is that a pulse lance is a magnetic bottle full of plasma, and the bottle has to close before the plasma vents. That's the trick. That's the entire trick. If you can keep the bottle from closing, you don't have a weapon anymore. You have a handheld oven. Are you with me?" The ensign made a small affirmative noise through her wire. "Good," Nate said. "The bottle has 3 things I care about. It's got a coil, and the coil is a shaped magnetic field. It's got a capacitor bank behind the coil, and it's got a shield emitter that keeps the plasma off the shooter's hand. The shield emitter is nice. That's what keeps your hand attached to your arm, but it also means the shooter thinks he's invincible because the shield emitter also throws up a defensive bubble around the muzzle. A pulse lance shooter walks around with, effectively, a personal energy shield about the size of a doorway, which is why your people have been losing to them for 20 years. You keep trying to shoot the shield with more energy. That's like trying to blow out a candle with a bigger candle. It doesn't work." The ensign was watching him. "Now," Nate said, "down home where I come from, we don't have plasma, we have rocks, and we have gunpowder. Gunpowder is a chemical reaction that pushes a rock really fast. If you push a rock really fast, and the rock is small and hard and dense, the rock doesn't care about your energy shield. Your energy shield is set up to deflect energy. Kinetic mass isn't energy. Kinetic mass is a rock. So the rock goes straight through the shield. It goes into the shooter. Do you see the problem for the pulse lance, folks? The ensign nodded slowly. Right, Nate said. He held up the pneumatic bolt driver. This is a rock thrower. It's a construction tool. It puts a tungsten bolt through structural steel. It also puts a tungsten bolt through a vreth. And the shield emitter never even lights up because the shield doesn't know a rock is coming. It's looking for lasers. He shrugged. That's it. That's the whole secret. You want to beat these guys? Quit trying to build a bigger laser. Build a rock thrower. We're not smart. We're just old. Our ancestors were killing each other with rocks for 100,000 years before we figured out how to make a fire hot enough to melt iron. We've had a lot of time to think about rocks. He paused, and then he added the second part of it. And this was the part that hurt Vielle the most later, when she watched the recording again. And I'll tell you something else about my kind of people, he said. We're not invincible. Please don't ever go home and tell the story that way, because it'll get somebody killed. We bleed, we break, we die. My daddy died at 61 because his lungs finally quit. His daddy died at 49 because the roof fell. My baby sister died at 11 because there wasn't a doctor in 50 kilometers on the night she got sick. We're not tough because we can't be hurt. We're tough because we got used to being hurt and we kept working anyway. We just make the other guy die a little faster than we do. That's all it is. That's all any human has ever been. He looked at his wrench. Also, he said more quietly, we've got long memories, and we've got families, and we've got a certain kind of stubborn that comes from having to wait a long time for anything to get better. That's the part your Vreth friends don't understand. They think fear works on us. It works on us. We just keep going through it. You gotta go through it. You can't go around. He stood up. 6 minutes, he said. Time to move. Stay in this closet. Lock the door behind me. If somebody comes through it that isn't me, use this. He pressed the coherent light pistol he had taken off the second sleeper into her good hand, showed her the safety, and stepped up into the ceiling. The ensign locked the door behind him. Vielle, on the private feed, did not realize for another 12 seconds that she was making a sound in the back of her throat. It was a very small sound. Her aide, standing beside her, pretended not to hear it. "Counselor," the aide said eventually, "what would you like me to do?" Vielle did not answer immediately. She was looking at the tactical feed. It showed a small mylar-wrapped shape moving through the ceiling of the service deck, unhurried, in the direction of the relay core. "Get me the manifest of every civilian vessel that has passed through this station in the last 30 cycles," Vielle said. "I want to know how the Belleran envoy became the Belleran envoy, and I want to know who paid the shipping cost of the container that brought a young Vreth cadet aboard in a ministrant's robe. Somebody arranged all of this. It was not the Thesseroi. The Thesseroi are only carrying the bag. Somebody in this council put the bag in their hand. I want a name." "Yes, ma'am," and Vielle said, "bring me a translator, a senior one, the best we have. I want to be sure I understand every word he says to me when he comes back out." "When he comes back out, Counselor." "When?" Vielle said. The relay core was 6 decks down from the service level, at the geometric center of the station, in a shielded compartment ringed with monitoring stations and a set of blast doors that had never, in the station's 40-year operational life, actually been closed. They had been designed to be closed and had never, in that time, needed to be. They were closed now. The Vreth Insertion Command, realizing halfway through their operation that they had lost contact with more than half of their team and that something had gone very badly wrong with the abort code, had done the thing a professional insertion team does when the mission slips. They had consolidated. 11 of the surviving Vreth had fallen back to the relay core and had, working together, sealed the blast doors from the inside. They had also, and this was the part that mattered, taken a hostage. The hostage was Vale's aide. The aide had been dispatched minutes before Nate reached the last approach corridor to a communication station 1 deck up from the relay core on Vale's orders to attempt an override of the beacon from the exterior. She had been intercepted in the hallway by two Vreth who had, unbeknownst to Vielle, split off from the main insertion package and taken a slightly different route through the ductwork. They had put a knife against the base of the aide's throat, and they had walked her, still walking, into the sealed relay core, and they had put her against the far bulkhead in front of the beacon assembly. Then, because Vreth doctrine on hostages was as old and as reliable as everything else about them, they had opened a channel and let Vielle see. "Counselor of the Keth Ra," said the voice on the channel. It was calm. The Vreth commander was a small, precise creature, dorsal ridges the color of aged bronze, whose translator produced a very cultivated version of Vielle's language. "We have concluded that the situation has deteriorated. We will make you an offer. Recall your asset. He is currently in the ceiling above the outer approach corridor, 3 meters from the door of this compartment. Recall him. Withdraw. In exchange, the summit collapses without bloodshed, the beacon remains intact, our fleet enters the system without engaging, and your aide keeps breathing. If you refuse, we vent the beacon room, and we destroy the aide, and the human comes through the door into a room full of ready pulse lances, and we shoot him down. The mathematics are simple. Please respond quickly." Vielle went absolutely still. She looked at the feed. The Vreth commander was correct. Nate was in the ceiling 3 meters from the door. He was, from the look of him, doing something with the ventilation control cluster, and he was doing it slowly and quietly. Vielle keyed the private line to the aide's earpiece. "Do you have your standard issue tool in your belt?" she said without preamble. The aide's voice came back, thin and steady. "Yes, Counselor." The standard issue tool was a Keth Ra multi-tool with a 2-centimeter locking blade. It was ceremonial and functional. Vielle's aide had been issued hers on her promotion. She wore it in a small horn sheath on her right hip. "Good," Vielle said. "In 4 seconds you will go limp. Complete dead weight. Do not resist. Do not signal. Fall as if you have fainted. Are you ready?" "Yes, Counselor." 4. Vielle said softly. 3, 2. She opened her outer channel. "Vreth Commander," she said, her voice going smooth and diplomatic and very, very slow. "You will forgive me. I am processing your offer. Understand that a decision of this weight requires consultation with..." The aide fell. She fell entirely as she had been ordered, dead weight, and the Vreth holding the knife jerked the blade back on instinct to avoid nicking her throat, and in that half-instant the aide's right hand went to her hip and came back up with the ceremonial multi-tool. She locked the blade open on the way. She drove it, without looking, into the Vreth's inner thigh at the femoral seam of his armor. It went in exactly as her instructors had once told her it would. The Vreth screamed. Nate came through the ceiling. He did not come through the door. He had never intended to come through the door. He had spent the last 4 minutes in the ventilation control cluster because the ventilation control cluster was, on this deck, a bypass for the pressure equalization system, and he had, moving carefully, isolated the compartment on the far side of the relay core from the compartment containing the beacon, and he had, without anyone noticing, dropped the pressure in the isolated compartment by exactly 32%, which meant that when he cut the ceiling panel over the relay room and the panel dropped away, air rushed from the beacon compartment into the isolated one. Hard, in a brief but very useful pressure equalization event that shoved every Vreth in the room a step off balance. Nate came down through the resulting hole in the ceiling. He landed on the beacon console because it was the highest hard surface in the room, and he was, again, not stupid. He landed with the pipe wrench in one hand and the pneumatic bolt driver in the other. Every Vreth in the room came up with a pulse lance. Every pulse lance in the room fired. They fired at where he had landed on the console. He was, by then, no longer there. He had, in the 0.2 of a second between coming down through the ceiling and being seen, launched himself off the console into the middle of the room, and he was in among the Vreth before they could adjust their lances back down through their own personal shields, which they could not do quickly because a pulse lance's shield emitter formed a bubble around the muzzle, and the muzzle was pointed up. He got the first one with the bolt driver. The bolt went in below the cranial armor at the joint of the mandible. That was one. He got the second one with the wrench across the back of the head. That was two. The third one had the presence of mind to reverse his pulse lance and swing it as a club. Nate ducked under it and put the wrench into his ribs. 3 quick, vicious hits, and then a fourth to the throat. That was 3. The fourth one had a knife. Nate got a puncture wound across his left forearm from that one before he broke the wrist that held the knife and drove the pommel back into the fourth Vreth's own face. That was 4. The fifth was the Vreth commander. The Vreth commander was small and fast. He had drawn a small blaster of a type reserved for close command. He had it up before Nate had finished with the fourth Vreth. He fired. He hit Nate in the abdomen, low and to the right, a small punctured entry that did not exit. Nate went down onto one knee. The commander was already stepping forward for the second shot. Viel's aide, still on the floor, still bleeding a little from a cut on her arm, where the initial knife had scored her, drove her locked-open multi-tool up into the Vreth commander's kneecap from below. The commander pitched forward. Nate caught him on the way down with the wrench across the temple. That was 5. There were 6 more Vreth in the compartment. There should have been 11. It was, Nate calculated later, the fact that the pressure equalization had thrown 3 of them into a bulkhead and knocked them silly for the crucial half-second. It was also the fact that a Vreth pulse lance was, as he had explained to a 17-year-old Kethra ensign in a service closet, useless against a moving target inside its own shield radius, and every one of those pulse lances had come up ready to shoot a doorway. He got the remaining 6, one at a time, over the following minute and a half, and by the time he got the last one, he was bleeding from 3 separate holes, and could no longer see clearly out of his left eye because a Vreth honor blade had opened his brow above it. He stood over the last body for a moment. He wiped his eye. He looked at the beacon. The beacon was a translucent column, 3 meters tall, humming softly with the sound of a wound about to be inflicted on interstellar space. The Thesseroi fleet was, according to the last update Viel had before communications went dark, 4 minutes from confirmed jump. Nate walked to the beacon. He put down the wrench. He knelt in front of it. He looked at the base of the column, where a service cover concealed the physical carrier signal generator. The piece of hardware that actually broadcast the coordinates outward, the piece that all the encryption and quantum entanglement and shielded relay logic ultimately depended on. It was, in the end, a piece of hardware. A very good piece of hardware. Someone had built it. Someone had installed it. Someone had used bolts. Nate had a bolt kit. He backed out the 4 bolts of the service cover with the pneumatic driver. He set the cover on the deck. He looked inside. He reached in, both hands. He found the carrier signal generator, a small dense unit about the size of his fist, and he closed his hands around it and he wrenched. He had, at that point, spent enough of his adult life wrenching things loose that his body knew the exact angle. Something inside the assembly gave with a small, protesting crack. The humming stopped. He pulled the carrier signal generator out of the beacon and let it drop to the deck. Then he sat down against the far bulkhead. His legs went out from under him. He pressed his jacket into his left forearm. He closed his eyes. The Thesseroi fleet did not jump. The summit held. Viel arrived at the relay core 11 minutes after the beacon went dark. She'd come down through the maintenance runs herself because the primary lifts had been locked out during the assault and had not yet been cleared. She'd come down alone because the sergeant of the guard was elsewhere, coordinating the extraction of the wounded honor guard, and she had refused to wait for an escort. She had climbed through service ladders she had not touched since her cadet days. Her formal robe had snagged twice on brackets. She had cut it loose with her own multi-tool. She stepped into the relay corps over the body of a Vreth commander, whose kneecap had been perforated by a 2-centimeter ceremonial blade, and she saw her aide first. Her aide was sitting against the beacon assembly, cradling one arm, alive. Her aide looked up and made a small salute that Vielle did not have the composure to return. Nate was against the far bulkhead. Vielle crossed the room to him. She knelt. "Coffee?" she said. His eyes came open. They were focused. They fixed on her face and did not waver. "Counselor," he said. His voice was raw. There was blood on his teeth. She reached, without thinking, for the wrist that was pressing the jacket into his forearm, and she moved his hand aside so she could see the wound. It was bad. The gash ran from the inside of his wrist to his elbow. It was deep enough she could see the pale hint of bone at one end of it. He had been packing it with the sleeve of his own coverall. He had done a competent job. "Medical is en route," she said. 2 minutes. Hold on." He looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to tell you something before they get here in case I stop talking. There was a third sleeper in the council chamber." "I know," Vielle said. "You subdued her. She's being interrogated." "Not her," Nate said. His voice was low. "There were 3 sleepers I could count. There's a 4th I couldn't. The 4th is the one who arranged the other 3. Vielle went still. "Explain." "The Belleran envoy changed his voice pattern 3 days ago. That means somebody swapped him in 3 days ago. The Thesseroi Observer's limp is wrong, which means somebody swapped him in about a week ago. The Ministrant kid was swapped in a week ago. 3 sleepers, 3 swaps, all inside a 10-day window. Somebody had to authorize the security passes. Somebody had to sign off on the credential renewals. Somebody in this council chamber, ma'am. Somebody with access to the credential system." Vielle's throat did the small, dry thing again. "I have that name," Nate said. "It came up on the transit log I saw in the observer quarters this morning, before I went up in the ceiling to fix the air handler. I flagged it in my morning report. Nobody reads my reports. It's Councillor Ram of the Orderland Trade Block, ma'am. He signed off on all 3 credentials in the same 10-day window. It's in the ledger. It'll be in the ledger. Have somebody look." Vielle stared at him. "You knew," she said. "You knew before you came in here. You had this before we voted." "I had it before you voted," Nate said. "I brought it in that morning. It was in the queue. I didn't get to hand it in personally because your session started early. It'll be in your aide's inbox under the tag Observer Intake Daily. I sent it at 0614. He winced. He shifted. He continued. "I would have told you at the door," he said. "But when I climbed down out of the vent, I heard your vote, and I figured if I opened with, 'By the way, one of the guys who just voted to kill me is the one running this whole thing,' you were going to hesitate. And hesitation was going to get people killed. So I put it aside. I volunteered. I fixed the pipe. I'm telling you now." Vielle did not answer for a moment. Behind her, at the door of the relay corps, the sergeant of the guard had arrived with the medical team. The medical team was moving fast. Vielle put a hand up without turning her head, and they held at the door. "Councillor Ram," she said. Her voice was very flat. "Ma'am," Nate said, "take him quietly. Don't put him on the docket. Put him in a room. He'll talk. His type always talks. Sorry, I know that's above my rank. That's advice." Vielle looked at him. "Corporal Coffee," she said very softly, "was your rank." He blinked once, then he smiled. It was a very small, tired smile, and it did not reach the hurt eye. "Ma'am," he said, "you read my file." "I read what was left of it." "Yes, ma'am." "There was very little left of it, Corporal." "No, ma'am, there wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not ask the question. She could feel it wanting to come up, and she pushed it back down. Every Talos survivor deserved to be asked the question at his own time, not at another's. She had been a soldier once. She remembered the shape of that. "Coffee," she said instead. What can I do for you? He thought about it. Ma'am, he said, is there anywhere on this station that serves real coffee? Not synthesized, not extracted from protein slurry, ground dark, from earth, actual beans. Viel's mandibles came together with a small dry click. She did not have an answer for that. She looked at her aide. Her aide, who was on her feet now, dabbing at her arm with a torn piece of Viel's own formal robe, looked back at her with the kind of steady, clear expression an aide adopted when she was thinking very fast and needed to look calm. Counselor, the aide said, the Terran ambassador keeps a private stock in his cabin, ground dark, from a place called Sumatra. I saw it labeled. 2 days ago I was there for a briefing. Signal him, Viel said. Wake him. I do not care about the hour. Tell him I'm asking personally for 1 cup of his coffee in this compartment in the next 10 minutes, or I will go to his cabin myself and take it. Word for word. Yes, Counselor. The aide left the compartment at a run. Viel looked back at Nate. The medics were on him now, moving fast, one working the forearm, one going for the abdomen. He did not flinch. He watched her over the top of the medic's hands. Corporal, she said again because the word had begun to matter, I owe you a debt this council cannot pay. No, ma'am, he said. You called me up for a job. I did the job. That's how work works, where I come from. I called you up because I thought you were disposable, she said. Yes, ma'am, I know. I was wrong. He watched her. He did not disagree. He did not accept it either. He simply let it sit in the air between them. Coffee, she said quietly. Tell me one thing, only one, and then I will let you rest. When you were 19, at Talos, what happened? The medic on his abdomen stopped moving for a beat, then resumed. Nate looked away, up at the scorched ceiling of the relay compartment. His eye, that was not swollen shut, moved, as if he were reading something on the ceiling that only he could see. Ma'am, he said after a moment, when I was 9 years old, my daddy took me down into a mine in Harlan County, Kentucky, to show me where he worked. It was a cage, on a cable, 200 meters straight down. We got to the bottom, and we walked a shift with him. He wanted me to see it, to know. Late in the shift, there was a small cave-in 3 levels over. Wasn't ours. Nobody hurt. But the cages went down for that. They said 40 minutes. 40 minutes turned into 2 hours. My daddy took me by the shoulders and he said, Nathan, when a cage doesn't come, you don't panic. You sit. You breathe slow. You count your breaths. You wait. Because if you panic, you use up your air and you die. If you wait, you live. That's the only trick there is. He paused. At Talos, he said, when it went bad and it was just me left and the recovery pilot was going to be 70 kilometers away in 3 days, I sat down against a rock and I counted my breaths and I waited. And then when the sun came up, I got up and walked. There isn't any more of a story than that. I sat. I breathed slow. I walked out. Viel was silent. That is not all of the story, she said softly. No, ma'am, he said, but that's the part I tell. She nodded. She did not push. The aide came back with a covered mug on a small enameled tray. She had run. Her breath was going faster than her carriage would admit. She held out the mug, and Viel took it, and Viel put it carefully into Nate's good hand. Nate looked down into the mug. Steam came off it. It smelled dark and burnt and honest. It smelled, Viel thought later, like a very specific piece of a very specific planet a very long way from this compartment. He drank a small, careful mouthful. His throat worked. He closed his good eye. He did not open it again for a while. Ma'am, he said, without opening his eye, that is good coffee. Please thank the ambassador for me. I will, Viel said. And, he added. He opened his eye. He looked at her, and there was something very warm and very tired in his face, the kind of tired that stops just short of the grave. With respect, Counselor, he said, about my job. Yes. I don't work for free. I know. I don't want a medal, ma'am. My people don't do medals. I want a raise, and I want a proper coffee ration on this station, and I want my report queue read every morning by somebody with signing authority, and I want that kid I zip-tied in the chamber given to me for a probation year so I can figure out who she was working for and give her back to her people alive. That's my ask. That's the whole ask. Take it or leave it. Vile's mandibles clicked softly. Corporal Coffee, she said. You will have every one of those things, and you will have an office next to mine, and you will have the standing authority to walk into any council session, and you will be paid, out of my personal purse if the Treasury balks, at the rate of a full delegate for the remainder of the summit and any successor summit. He shook his head once weakly. Ma'am, he said, that's too much. Corporal, she said, that is exactly enough. He considered that. He looked at the mug. He drank another careful mouthful. He looked at her again. All right, ma'am, he said, long as we're clear. But I want it on the record. I don't wash windows. On the record, Corporal, she said. Her mandibles clicked again, harder, and this time it did carry the shape of laughter, and every medic in the compartment turned around because they had never, in a career of long service in this chamber, heard Councillor Vale of the Kethra laugh aloud. You are not, under any conditions, required to wash windows. Thank you, ma'am. Corporal. Ma'am, sleep now. I will still be here when you wake. So will the coffee. He nodded once. His eye closed. The medic on his abdomen worked faster. Councillor Ram of the Orderland Trade Block was arrested that same hour in his private cabin without a shot fired by the sergeant of the guard on the personal warrant of Councillor Vale over the polite but firm objection of the Orderland legal attaché. The credential ledger was, as Nate had predicted, sitting exactly where Nate had said it would be. Councillor Ram confessed within 9 hours to receiving payment from a Thesseroy commercial intermediary to broker the sleeper insertion in exchange for a preferential concession on a mining tract in the outer system. His type had, as Nate had predicted, talked. The young Vreth cadet with the wrong-coloured tears was, at Nate's insistence and Viel's signature, remanded to the observer delegation's custody for a probationary period of 1 solar cycle, during which she was to work as a junior technician on the same maintenance detail Nate had, until recently, run alone. Her name, in her own language, was a set of harmonic clicks the translator crushed to a single syllable and rendered as Clara. Nate called her Clara. She answered to it. 6 months into her probation, she would submit in her own hand a written brief to Councillor Viel requesting formal defection status from the Vreth Ascendancy and permanent placement with the Terran Observer Delegation. Viel would grant it. The summit held. The summit produced, 3 months after the events described here, the Coffee Accords, so named over Nate's furious objection by the assembled council. In a unanimous vote he was not permitted to attend, and could not, therefore, veto. He would spend the rest of his working life trying to get people to stop calling them the Coffee Accords. He would not succeed. Viel would keep his office next to hers for the remainder of her tenure, which would run another 23 cycles. She would learn, in that time, to drink coffee. She would learn, in that time, to say the word wrench. She would, in the last year of her tenure, on the occasion of a visit from an Earth delegation, request 1 item from Earth to keep in her personal chambers upon her retirement. It was a small, dense, black object with the word Holbrook stamped along its jaw. The delegation was surprised. She did not explain. She kept it on a shelf beside her desk for the rest of her life, and when visitors asked what it was, she would say only that it was a tool for taking apart mine cages, and that a friend of hers had once used one to keep a summit from ending in fire, and that some tools, if you were fortunate, ended up in your hand at exactly the right moment. 6 hours before all of this, in a ventilation shaft above a council floor, a human utility technician had heard himself voted expendable, finished tightening a bolt, pocketed a protein bar, climbed down, and volunteered first. That in the end was the whole story, and it was also not the whole story, and every version of it that gets told across 3 arms of the spiral for 100 years afterward still ends with the same last line, delivered by the same tired man from the floor of the same scorched relay corps, holding a mug of coffee against his chest as if it were the last honest thing left in the universe. "Ma'am," he said, "about the window washing. That's it. That's the whole tale. What a ride. What a beautifully explosive ending. A wrench, a mug of coffee, a beacon severed, a council remade. The real weapon in the end isn't the pulse lance or the plasma or the shield. It's the quiet, stubborn kind of person who sits still, breathes slow, waits for the cage, and then walks the whole 70 kilometers when the cage never comes." If this story hit you where it lives, drop a like right now. It's genuinely what keeps stories like this one on the air and coming to you. Share it with a friend of yours who loves sci-fi about the human standing alone against the impossible. They'll thank you for it. Subscribe and turn the bell on so the next HFY epic lands in your feed the moment it drops. And here's the one for the comments, because I want to know. If you had been in that chamber, would you have hired Nate Coffey to train your entire honor guard? Or would you have taken his advance pay in Sumatran coffee beans and quietly caught the next transport back to Earth? Tell me down below. And until the next one, keep looking at the stars and keep an eye on the dark between them.